All right, gang, we're going to talk about the beginnings of industrialization today. So, we're going to talk about the changes that began in Britain, to be honest with you, and how they sort of paved the way for the modern industrial society that we live in today. So, this is going to be your kickoff for the Industrial Revolution. We've drawn our maps of our little village growing into an industrial city, if you will. And now we'll kind of figure out how that happened and how that all kind of came to a start. And what's crazy is that it all really started with some advances in agriculture. Some crazy things were going on historically in England, the UK, Britain at this time. A thing called enclosure was happening. And this is rich people were throwing poor people off their land, to be honest with you. Small farmers were basically forced off of the land because they were making some advancements that made it easier to grow food, and they did not need as many people. Okay. As you see, they're starting to come up with things like Jethro Tull was a guy that invented something called a seed drill. You had other sorts of planting devices and plowing devices and things like that. They were still going horse-drawn on this kind of stuff, but they were able to rig these mechanisms to where they were able to plant more quickly, plow more quickly, and eventually reap and harvest more quickly as well. So these sorts of things are going to be changing. There are going to be some other advancements as well, to be honest with you. Advances in livestock, breeding, and how to get the best sheep for the best wool, the best horses for, draft horses, gigantic horses like Clydesdales. If you'd ever seen them, they even bred horses to be really small to work in coal mines. It was really kind of crazy, the things that they came up with. And this was also a way to grow cattle and hog and things like that in such a way that they were able to produce more food. More food means more people. So you're going to see a population growth as well. And speaking of more food, they started to understand some things that you learn with our ag department today, and that's crop rotation. They understood or started to understand that planting different crops each year could keep nutrients in the soil and things like that. So all of these things going on in England at this time kind of set it up to be the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And that's why we kind of look at it as sort of a touchstone main best example. So why England? Well, here's a chart right here that kind of tells you all of the things that they had going for them. For one thing, you need to understand the actual country of England, not England, Wales, and Scotland, and all that other kind of stuff, although it's not much bigger. But the actual country of England is only about the size of the state of North Carolina. And that's kind of hard for us to grasp, but that is actually the case. You check the square mileage on England and North Carolina on Google, and it's almost exactly the same. But they had some natural advantages. They had lots of rivers because they get lots of rainfall. They had coal, and not just having coal, but they had coal that was close to the surface to make it easier to mine. They had large iron deposits and sheep, lots of sheep. And if you've ever seen crazy video of like old golf courses and stuff like that, they were actually built for sheep. It's the craziest thing. But they also had man-made canals. They had a free market economy, which makes capital or money pretty easy to get to. They had a national banking system. And as we said, the enclosures and property rights are going to make it to where they are able to control their own land. They didn't have a lot of the problems that some other places had. This is an industrial map kind of showing you some places in England, Wales, and Scotland. And let's see, my people are from up around this area, supposedly, according to Ancestry.com. The area, the line between England and Scotland is roughly right through here. Edinburgh, Glasgow are in Scotland. But you see, these are coal fields and things like that, man. And you're seeing population. London used to be basically the only major size area in London. I'm sorry, London was the only major size place in England, but that is going to change. So why England? Got this big population of people, lots of natural resources, and they were politically stable. And when you have a stable government, that makes things a lot easier. Next, we'll move on to inventions. There were a lot of inventions, a lot of a lot of mental capital being used at the time. And these inventions specifically were for textiles. I just put a couple of them on here for you to have some ideas about what they look like. The flying shuttle that you see right here, that flying shuttle is a way to send thread back and forth through a loom, which is actually what this is. And this is a water frame that ran off of turning water wheels that I talked about with our mapping thing, that made it work without people having to use foot pedals. You used to have Granny out on the front porch with a thing called a spinning jenny, doing it by herself. And a lot of people, a lot of women did these homemade, handmade stuff, and then they would combine it together. And earlier mills would take that and make it into stuff. Well, these things make those people unnecessary as well. So these people doing this homemade, handmade stuff that then got turned in to companies to make into shirts and fabrics and other stuff like that. Well, they basically lose their work to these mechanization, to machines taking people's jobs. So they will need to leave the front porch and actually go into the factory. The cotton gin, obviously, Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin, which actually takes seeds out of the cotton, made cotton explode in the south of the United States, which is where a lot of the English cotton came from, along with Egypt and some other holdings that they had. And then finally, a water-powered loom, man, which ran these shuttles back and forth, crazy time, to how quickly they could make fabric and things like that, and really produce it. And the more they produce, it drives the price down on the stuff, so more people could afford it as well. Next up, you got my man James Watt here in the picture, and he is probably one of the top 10 most important people in world history, and hardly anybody knows that much about him. His name may sound familiar when you're looking at light bulbs, because they use his name as a measure of energy these days scientifically. But he invented something called the steam engine. His Watt's steam engine was a way to burn coal, boil water. The water expands and the vapor expands, and it pushes up on a piston, and the piston would go up and down and turn a wheel. Now, the reason I say this guy is a top tenner is that this is the exact same basic principles that are used in coal-fired power plants today. But to be honest with you, it's also the same principles that are used in nuclear power plants today. They just use nuclear fission to create the heat instead of burning coal. And you still have the same water heated up, forms of vapor, it expands, pistons go up and down, turns wheels, and all that kind of stuff. So this steam engine is going to do a whole ton of things for transportation specifically. But another thing they used it for was to pump water. They were able to pump water out of the coal mines. And once they can get to more coal, all this stuff starts to take off. So check it, take a look. You're going to see, you remember all those rivers, those canals that they had? Well, they came up with steamboats, paddle boats, that the steam-powered Watts engine was able to turn these paddles, and now you can go upstream. You don't just have to float stuff downstream anymore. So they would clear out their rivers of brush and debris and snags and logs and things like that, and then they would use them in these powered boats going up and down these rivers. And then next, hey, we don't even need water anymore. You're going to see an advent in the ground transportation with steam-driven locomotives. Okay, the first ones were around the 1820s to 1830s, and then this is going to mean that they can actually carry tons and tons of supplies over land. If you look at this picture, it's kind of crazy because it's a steam engine, obviously, but then it's almost like they took regular carriages and hooked to it because they just couldn't get away from that thought process of just using the regular carriages on locomotive wheels. But eventually they move on to where you got the understanding that the railroad is going to change Britain fundamentally. And even in this day and age, if you look at a map of the UK, it is just crisscrossed by their railroad system. I mean, it's a way to transport goods, transport people. It created new jobs on itself. And what it did is it caused a huge burst in agricultural sales as well, because they can move stuff more quickly in large quantities. But then you think about fishing, you know, fishing on the coast. England's a gigantic island, fishing on the coast and bringing in salted fish and other stuff like that into the interior and stuff like that. And then the crazy thing, the same sort of thing that happened to my family, to be honest with you, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it encouraged country people to come into cities and take jobs, to come into these areas that were starting to grow, these industrial areas that were starting to grow. And then, step in. Next thing you know, they're going to be moving and working in these factories, and cities are going to start to grow, and then things are going to start to get crazy, which will lead to some issues with industrialization that we'll talk about later on.